Hi everybody, it's really brilliant that we've managed to pull together a meeting. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
I'm Ingala Smith. I've worked in services for women who've been subjected to men's violence for 29 years now. I'm currently chief exec of a charity called Nyah-Nyah. Nyah started as Hackney Women's Aid in 1975. So we're based in East London and we provide domestic and sexual violence services to women, girls and children. Our services include community-based domestic violence services, East London rape crisis, a specialist refuge for women with problematic substance use, and a specialist refuge for women fleeing sexual exploitation, prostitution, trafficking and grooming. That refuge is called Daria House, which is especially meaningful in Leeds because it was named after Dario Pionco, who was murdered a few years ago in the so-called Leeds managed ground for prostitution. Prostitution is never safe. Of course, we work with women who've been subjected to domestic and sexual violence, men's violence. Of course, we will work with women who have been subjected to violence from a female partner, but in reality, that's a tiny number of women, whereas we work face-to-face with 1,500 women a year approximately, and much more over the phone and by the internet. In addition to my day job, I run a project called Counting Dead Women, commemorating women killed in the UK by a man, and I'm co-founder of the Femicide Census in partnership with Women's Aid. I started Counting Dead Women almost 7 years ago after the murder on the 2nd of January 2012 of a young woman in East London. Her name was Kirsty and she was 20 years old. Kirsty had been referred to Nyah a few weeks before she was killed. When I heard about her death, and I was just coming back from a boozy New Year holiday, I did what I think many of us would do. I got onto the internet to see what I could find out about this murder of a young woman. And even though I've been working in the field of women affected by men's violence for years, and Kirsty isn't the first woman who's been killed and been part of a service that I've worked for, I was perplexed by what I found because there just seemed to be report after report of women who've been killed by men in the week or so since Christmas, just so many. So I started making a note of the names because I wanted to figure out how many women it was. It turned out that in the first 3 days of 2012, 8 women had been killed by men. So 3 days, 8 dead women. 3 had been shot, 1 had been stabbed, 1 had been strangled with a dog lead, 1 had been battered with a blunt object before she was smothered with a pillow. 1, a 77-year-old woman, was beaten to death with her own walking stick. And 1, an 87-year-old woman, was battered to death with blunt force trauma by her own grandson. Since then, I've counted and named 955 women killed by men in the UK. That's an average of 1 woman dead at the hands of a man every 2.5 days. I've read and absorbed the detail of each and every one of these killings by men. I've researched the life and death of each woman. I grew up in Huddersfield in the 1970s and 80s. That meant growing up under the shadow of Peter Sutcliffe. I know there's a lot of Leeds women in this room, so you'll know exactly what I mean. I was 7 when he killed 28-year-old Will McCann, as far as we know, his first murder victim. I was 12 when he killed his last. He was charged in 1981, when I was a few weeks shy of 13, for murdering 13 women in less than 6 years. It's no exaggeration to say that his violence was a formative influence on me. And at the same time, the man who I thought was my dad was violent and abusive to my mum and us kids, and there was violence and abuse in some of my friends' early relationships. So men's violence has been part of my life, one way or another, for longer than I can remember. But I've got a nice home now, I've got a partner that I love and that loves me, and I've got a good job. I'm fortunate. Tonight, I want to talk to you about why I think women-only spaces and services are essential for women and children who have been subjected to men's violence, women who don't benefit from the security and safety that I enjoy. Transgender ideology creates an environment that is hostile to specialist single-sex services for women who have been subjected to men's violence, and one in which women cannot set our own boundaries. 80% of rapes of adults are committed against women, and women are the victim in 80% of domestic homicides. Males, on the other hand, males commit 78% of violent crime recorded in England and Wales. Males commit 88% of intimate partner homicides. Males commit 90% of all murders in England and Wales. Males commit 98% of recorded sexual offences. One of the most important ways that we can contribute to creating a safe space for women who have experienced men's violence is quite simply by keeping men out. It's simple stats. Men are much more likely to commit violence than women. I'm not naive and dishonest enough to claim that women are never violent. Of course some women are. But when women are violent, and remember it's much less statistically frequent, when they generally cause less harm than violent men. So let's have a look at men who identify as trans. There's no credible evidence to suggest that males who identify as trans commit violence against women at any lower rate than males who do not identify as trans. In fact, evidence suggests that trans-identified males commit violence at rates comparable to men. I'm not saying that men who identify as transgender are inherently violent, or that all trans-identified males are violent, just that they are no less violent than other males. Despite claims to the contrary, gender recognition certificates and/or identification as trans does not reduce men's violence. They don't magic away male socialisation. Self-declaration, even worse, would mean that any man who says he's a woman would be able to access specialist services for women subjected to men's violence, unless those services understand how to and have the guts to apply the Equality Act exemptions. And there's serious pressure which prevents many from not, if not most, from not doing this. Some say that we, those of us who run specialist women's services, can use risk assessments to assess whether a male who says he's trans poses a risk to women. Let's look at that in relation to women's refuges. When a risk assessment is completed with a woman looking to move into a refuge, time is critical. You need to help her to get to a place of safety and quickly. She's either already left her home or is planning to do so urgently because she's in danger. With the risk assessment, you're assessing the risk that she's safetying from her partner. You're planning how she can leave with the least possible risk. You're assessing whether the refuge offers safety or whether it'd be somewhere that she might easily be found, and also whether she herself would pose a risk to others living in the refuge. You're not assessing whether or not she is actually a violent male. If you expect refuges to accommodate males who identify as trans, you're asking staff in women's refuges to differentiate between transgender people born male who have genuinely experienced men's violence and who have managed to unpick their male socialisation and who will not use their sense of male entitlement or sexism or misogyny to harm, reduce or control women in the refuge, if such people exist. You're asking to differentiate between those and those transgender people born male who have genuinely experienced violence but are still dripping in male privilege and advantage and who hate or resent women, and also those transgender people born male who are narcissistic perpetrators who've managed to convince themselves and others that they are the victims, and those transgender people born male who are fetishists, and men who are pretending to be trans in order to track down a particular woman or access women in general. I don't know any test that would help me differentiate between those transgender people born male. Why should we be put in this position? Why should women and children who have experienced men's violence be put in that position? Why should under-resourced women's specialist services be expected to meet men's needs? Why is prioritising the needs of women who have been subjected to men's violence such a problem? Refuges and other specialist services as women-only spaces offer not only a physical but also a psychological and emotional escape from men's domination, control and violence, away from the specific man that they're escaping or who has violated them, away from men in general, away from men's control and demands for attention, away from the male gaze and the way that males judge women. A space where women can share in common our experiences of abuse, despite all the other differences between us. Women tell us that they want and value women-only spaces for these reasons: for safety, for empathy. It enables trust, it feels more comfortable, they're able to focus on women's needs, there's expertise, they can share confidences with each other because they find them less intimidating. Women say that a women-only space has been an essential part of their recovery from men's violence, and that being with women who've had similar experiences is a vital part of accepting that they're not to blame. At least 80% of males who identify as trans retain a penis. Do adult penises belong in women's refuges and rape crisis centres? Do adult penises belong in women's prisons? Remember, women in prison have usually been victims of crimes far more serious than those for which they were convicted, and most have experienced men's violence. Many of the women and children that we work with are terrified of males. They will, like most of us here, almost always instantly read somebody who might be the most kind, gentle, empathic, trans-identified male in the world. They will almost always immediately read that person as male, and they may experience terror involuntarily immediately. They need and they deserve a break. Women are gaslighted, in other words manipulated to question their own sanity, by abusive male partners all the time. It's furthering the abuse of women who have already been abused to then expect them to share women-only spaces with males who say that they're a woman, because they are not. The Gender Recognition Act has created what's described by Professor Kathleen Stock as a legal fiction. Males can be recognised as women under the law in some circumstances, but that doesn't mean that they really are women. Some people might choose to use preferred pronouns as a sign of courtesy to trans people, but it doesn't really mean that those people believe that a person can change sex. A person cannot change sex. It undermines our ability to help women believe in themselves if we put them in positions where we expect them to believe this lie. Some say that men will not go as far as to lie about being trans in order to access vulnerable women. Anybody who believes this hasn't spent much time with abusive men and has little idea of the lengths that some men are prepared to go to. Men like retired police officer Bill Dowling, who called his ex-partner Victoria Rose to help him because he said he was coughing up blood. Even though she'd separated, she went to help. When she arrived, he shot her in the head. Men like Darren Sykes, who lured his 9 and 12-year-old sons Paul and Jack into the attic with a promise of a new train set. As they played, he poured petrol around the house before setting it alight and turning the home into an inferno. His intention, and what he achieved, was lifelong mental torture for Claire Throssell, his ex-wife, mother of the 2 now dead children. Men like Stephen Wood, a child abuser on remand for multiple rapes with a long record of sexual and violent offences against women and girls, who said he was trans and despite retaining his full male genitalia was sent to Newhall prison where, under the name of Karen White, he had assaulted 4 inmates within days of him arriving. I know these are extreme examples. Most women who experience men's violence are not killed, and most men do not kill their children, but they illustrate the lengths that some men are prepared to go to. And those of us who know violent men, or women who have been victims of violent men, know that there are too many men who would go exactly this far. Violent men lie and manipulate. Violent men are prepared to stand in court in a witness box and lie. According to data we found for the femicide census, of 37 men who pleaded not guilty to murdering women in 2006 and 16, only 1 was actually found not guilty of all charges. We're told that trans people are disproportionately victims of violence, and this may be true. As a human being, I support efforts to reduce crime, violence, hate and discrimination against anyone. As a feminist, I applaud those who reject the trappings of gender. But as a feminist, I cannot stand by if women are being sold out in this process. If we look at homicide, in the last decade in the UK, there have been 8 homicides of trans people, all were biologically male. On the other hand, trans people, and all of these were biologically male, have killed at least 11, and 4 of their victims were women. And in the same period, men have killed at least 1,373 women. So there are 2 main issues here, but both are issues that reduce the safety of women because of the erosion of women-only space. Males will lie about being trans in order to access women and children, and males who identify as trans commit violence at rates akin to those males who do not identify as trans. I don't really care which group we're talking about. My concern is women, especially those women who've been subjected to men's violence. This is not about lack of compassion with trans people. It's not about denying anybody's human rights, anybody's privacy or dignity. Of course not. But it is about fighting for women's human rights, our right to safety, our right to life, our privacy, our dignity. It is about recognising that women have sex-based rights and protections for a reason. Men have already killed at least 101 women this year. Many thousands of women have been raped. Many thousands of women live with the threat of violence every day. Victim survivors of men's violence deserve the breather, the sanctuary that is offered by a woman-only space. Of course it's too late for women who have been killed. We need to fight for single-sex spaces and services. Let's not play Russian roulette with the lives of women who've already suffered men's violence. The fight against domestic violence and abuse and sexual violence has been led by women supporting women. We wouldn't have a network of refuges and domestic violence and abuse services or rape crisis centres if feminist activists and survivors, women like Jalna and Sandra, I know are both here tonight, and of course many women are both activist and survivor, had not created them from the 1970s onwards because we realised that women needed them and that we, women, want to support other women facing what we've faced. And whilst women have succeeded in creating change and we have built this fantastic network of specialist services, this has always been under threat and now it's under an increased threat. We still haven't managed to eradicate men's violence against women, nor indeed overthrow the patriarchy. It's our responsibility, those of us here now, to protect what our 4 sisters created and continue that legacy that helps women escape and recover from men's violence.